Good morning. So glad to be here. So let me just share my intention for the morning. My intention is to share some ideas that I hope will be helpful and also hopeful, but to also tell a story of what I think is happening in the world right now that is as truthful as possible, right? So I'm trying to be both truthful and helpful and hopeful, which is hard to pull off nowadays. But I think in order to do that, what I'm going to need to do is to talk not just about things that are happening in the world, but talk about the ways that people are making sense of the world. And we're going to be thinking about different ways of making sense of the world so that we can orient ourselves in a way that is helpful and hopeful. And we're also going to be talking about ways that we relate to each other and talk to each other so that we can help each other make sense of the world and also to help it be a peaceful world, right? That's the intention, is understanding and peace, but really kind of looking as deeply as we can into what actually needs to happen in order for that to happen. So there are many things going on in the world right now, right? There are many crises happening. There's a lot of focus and attention on what people are referring to as the climate crisis. But I think it's really important to see that most or all of the problems that we're experiencing in the world today are really overlapping and interdependent and interlocking. So it's really a meta-crisis that we're dealing with. It's an interrelated web of manifesting problems, and we are the source of those problems, right? There's a lot of things happening. The many problems that we're dealing with in the world today are interrelated, and we want to really understand not just what's happening, but what are the underlying generative functions for these problems? What are some of the root sources and causes, right? So we're thinking about things like economic inequality, psychological trauma, mass shootings, police shootings, nationalism, racism, the concerns about runaway technology and artificial intelligence, the fact that we have a hyper-partisan and gerrymandered and dysfunctional political structure, right? We have a culture of victimhood. We have a fragile economic system that's based on perpetual debt and interest-bearing debt that leads to perpetual growth, which is actually a generator for a lot of the problems that we have in the world right now. So we have to try to understand how these things are related and why are people perpetuating these problems, right? Like, again, we need to look at ourselves and see how we are implicated. And another layer of the problem is that it's just really hard to get clarity on what's going on. The problems are so complex and so big, no individual can really be an expert on every single problem, right? So we have a tendency to revert to shared identities, and we have certain people that we trust. So maybe I listen to Fox News all day, and that's my trusted source, so I'm going to go with what they say, or somebody else listens to MSNBC all day, and we're not really experts, but we start to feel like we have a strong narrative, like we really know what's going on because we're listening to other voices and we're trusting them. But we're not really doing the deep thinking ourselves. We're not really looking at data ourselves. And we're falling into groupthink in a lot of ways. And the problem is there's different groups and different identities that are kind of in rivalry against each other. And we have to find a way to break out of that rivalry and get to real sense-making and deep thinking about the bigger picture. So what I'm saying is we need a new story. We need a bigger story that includes different perspectives and different voices to help us make sense of what's going on. We have to get out of the mimetic tries and the cultural warfare that's happening and the narrative warfare that's happening is one way of describing our media nowadays. There's different narratives and they're battling against each other, and it's very tribal and it's very identity-centric, and we have to find a way to get beyond that because it's a very pluralistic and complicated world that we live in, but we're experiencing fragmented pluralism, right? It's not integrated. We don't feel like we're an integrated whole as a society. There's too much fragmentation and division, right? So how do we make peace with that? How do we come to peace around that? So one helpful thing to do is actually to just take a step back and get more abstract. So it may seem weird to sort of move away from the concrete problems that we're talking about, but I think big picture abstraction is really crucial to understand complexity and problems as big as what we're dealing with, right? So we actually want to have a big picture view so that we avoid reducing the bigness of our problems to something that's too small. So for instance, this is a really helpful heuristic I find It's a way of thinking about how everything that happens we can experience through our emotions, our thoughts, like our direct experience of it. There's like my experience of what's happening, but there's also objective things happening in the world. There's lots of activity, there's lots of behavior, there's lots of things that are actually happening in the world. And there are social structures, there are systems, networks, laws, governments, technology, the school system, infrastructure. We're all living in a built environment, a built world that impacts our psychology, our emotions, our thinking. And we have shared intersubjective values, beliefs, our culture, right? So all these things are interacting all the time. We're influenced by our culture. We're having our own personal psychology, and everyone has their own personal perspective and viewpoint. So we're translating the world in different ways, and we're all influenced by the world and by our environment. So we can't reduce the problems to what's going on out there. So for instance, with climate change, we can't just focus on carbon. The problem is not carbon. The problem is what's happening in our social systems and our systems of production that interrelate with our culture and our values and our beliefs, but interrelate with the way individuals think and perceive and make sense of the world, right? And all those things are interacting with each other. So you can't really address a social problem if you don't address individual psychology. And you can't really address individual psychology because there's really no such thing as individuals separate from a culture. So you have to look at the culture itself. But you can't really address a culture without looking at media, technology, jobs, economy, and how people are experiencing the world, because that's influencing their values and beliefs and thoughts. So that's why it's a wicked problem, right? All these things are related. So we have to be able to take a step back and see them all and not fall into reducing the problem to, oh, the problem is because so-and-so thinks like this. Or the problem is these people are doing this, right? Or no, the problem is that production is like this and the economy is like this. We can't separate it. As try as we might, it's never going to be resolved by isolating a problem and focusing on it and blaming something in isolation. So that's one of the moves that we have to make, is get out of that tendency to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about more how deeply rooted that tendency is, why that tendency is there, and what it means to actually move beyond that. And in order to do so, again, big picture, we have to actually think about how things got to be the way they are. I think it's really easy to just be living in the world and have ideas about the way things should be, and then when things aren't the way we want them to be, that causes emotions and thoughts, and we want it to be different, but we're not really thinking about how things emerge and why things are the way they are. So I think we need to broaden and deepen our understanding of history and evolution. And what's happening in a lot of the fields of study nowadays is that we're refining our understanding of teleology and directionality through complexity, right? So there have been different ideas in the past about evolution, about a sort of linear march of progress, right? And we've come to see that that's really simple and fundamentally not true in a lot of ways. As we can see with the complexity of the problems that we have, we're clearly not on a linear road to progress. Things are not just getting better and better and better. It's much more messy than that. But there is still a way in which things emerge dialectically. So if you look at physical systems, from atoms to molecules to cells to multicellular organisms, there is this sort of growth process. And the same thing is true with cultural values and the way people make sense of the world. We're getting more and more complex. So both the physical world is getting more and more complex, and our perception, our consciousness is also getting more and more complex. So there's this directionality in evolution toward increasing complexity and increasing consciousness, right? So we're trying to make sense of how do we get all the problems that we're getting if those things are true. So one thing we'll want to understand in complex systems, something that's called strange attractors. So strange attractors are a pattern or an equilibrium that emerges and is likely to stabilize in a certain system, such as a society, right? So you can think of something like nation states. Nation states emerged as something that became a really logical way for people to organize themselves. And once that emerged, it became a really dominant structure, right? You can think of something like electricity and the way that we've electrified the whole planet. Once something like that is discovered, it becomes an attractor and it spreads like fire, right? You can't you can't de-electrify the world. Once it emerges, it's going to spread. It has a strong attraction to it. Similar to what's happening now with digitization. There's a process where everything's getting digitized, and we can't stop it. It's like there's this strong pull forward, and it's happening. So feeling into what's happening now, too, one thing we want to be thinking about is what are the attractors that are pulling us forward? Like what, of all the messiness that's happening right now, what's pulling us? Where are we moving toward? Where are we heading toward? And one way to think about that, one clear trend that we're seeing, as things get more complex and as people become more conscious, we're becoming more interconnected and interdependent, right? We're becoming a global world. We're becoming one connected species globally. Now that's a really messy process, right? Because historically, throughout our past, that has not been the case. So we all evolved and adapted in environments when we were not all connected. We were not exposed to people all around the world who we don't know personally, right? There was a big shift that happened from hunting and gathering to agrarian society, where groups of people got much, much larger, right? Prior to the agrarian revolution and the development of the initial sort of states and big farming-based city-states and communities, people kept in really small groups, and they didn't really have a sense of accumulation. They didn't really have a sense of scarcity. Things really, really shifted when we started having bigger and bigger groups. And now those bigger and bigger groups are having to interact with each other without really knowing each other the way that we did when we were in close proximity to each other in the past. So see, these are some of the bigger picture things we need to be thinking about when we step back from the day-to-day news. But my basic claim is that if we're going to have a big story, if we're going to have a narrative that actually integrates the fragmentation that we see in society, if we're going to have a universal story of humanity, it has to be something that fits the reality of what we know from science, but it has to include everyone. So how do we actually have a story that sees how we are all one human family, and we can understand our differences and the tensions that are emerging and the problems that are emerging as part of the complexities that arise by the process that we're in, which is this process of evolution. So thinking about that more, when we think about things evolving, again, we're not just thinking about the objective systems that evolved. We're not just thinking about the physical individual bodies that evolved. We're also thinking about the subjective and the intersubjective. How did thinking change? How did emotions change? How does experience change? How does culture and values and beliefs and narratives change over time as physical evolution proceeded? So one way to think about that is the emergence of collective worldviews. And the mind states that emerged, again, through agrarian times, through the development of nation states, through the Industrial Revolution, that was an environment for human beings to evolve in and grow in that influenced how they thought, it influenced how they felt, it influenced their identity, it influenced how they felt about their relationship between them and their family, their identity as a family, maybe their race or their ethnicity or their neighborhood. There's a sort of identity there, or maybe your nation, right? So then the nation develops, and we start to have this sense of, well, I'm an individual, but I'm part of a nation or a country, and then that's part of my identity, which is a radical shift from how people understood themselves previously, right? But these are the kinds of taken for granted background assumptions and ways of thinking and feeling and being in the world that emerged in relationship with the world that we were living in. But the world is very, very different now, right? So the issue is that the adaptation that needs to emerge is a sort of metacognition where we can think about how we should be thinking and being now, right? The world is so different now than it has been, and our consciousness needs to also keep expanding and developing so that we develop the capacity to actually figure out for ourselves what would be the way that we would have to identify as a human being in order to be attuned with and aligned with the complexity of a globally connected species, right? So we're actually at that juncture where throughout history we can look back and we can see, okay, people developed certain ways of identifying and thinking and relating, and it was always rooted in some kind of rivalry or in-group, out-group, right? Whether it was your tribe or your family or your nation or your race, people generally have had limited identities and limited circles of empathy and compassion. It's deep, deep, deep rooted in us. And the process of transcending that is a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask for people. It's not easy, and yet we're looking at the world today and we're seeing that is exactly what is necessary, right? We have to adapt and evolve and shift our identity and shift our thinking to become post-cultural and post-limits in terms of in-group and out-group. Because the world that we're living in is very different than the world of our ancestors. So we can't use the mechanisms and structures that got us to where we are, right? We have to identify the structures that have emerged and see why they're not working and how they're not working, and then how we should think, right? So the attractor that we can intuit has to be enacted through us so that we can create a different future. So this is sort of the thinking that we need to do. Okay, these are the way people have thought in the past. That was their world. This is our world. How are we creating new stories and new values to include everyone? So thinking about that, we need to think more about individual psychology, right? So we're moving from thinking about big picture evolution to thinking about how different worldviews have emerged over time for groups. Now if we're looking at the individual today, okay, we've evolved through that. We have all of that as our history, but how are we thinking about what perspectives are available to us? So you don't need to be able to read this. I realize it's a little bit fuzzy. The point is, this is moving up to increasing complexity, and these are all different theorists and different ways of thinking about it, and there's dozens more. So the point is that there's many, many, many different ways to think about human development. We can think about the development of cognition, we can think about the development of self-identity, we can think about different orders of consciousness, we can think about the evolution of values, the evolution of morals, the evolution of faith, right? We can theorize differently about how we're growing and what the different stages are. Those details aren't important. I can give you great book recommendations if you're interested in the evolution of faith, for instance. Read Stages of Faith by James Fowler. If you're interested in the development of identity, read In Over Our Heads by Robert Keegan, right? If you're interested in really integrating how all these together, Ken Wilber has a book called Integral Psychology that shows charts of over 100 different developmental models and how they all match up. But that's the point, they all match up, right? They're all speaking to something real that's intersubjectively valid. It's not just, oh, this person has their theory and this person has their theory. No, there's actually something that they're charting, which is there is this movement, right? And it's sort of a dangerous truth. There is a real dialectical relationship to human development, meaning there is a progressive, increasingly complex movement that we can move through as people. And it's dangerous because we have to acknowledge that there's a certain kind of hierarchy there, right? Some views are better than others. The mature adult who has a big heart and empathy and compassion for other people is better than the really narcissistic child who can't do that and goes around hitting people, right? We have to make value judgments there. But it's harder when we're not talking about children and adults and we're talking about things regardless of age. But it's just true, and we have to find a way to weave it into a story that makes sense for everyone and that allows everyone to be fundamentally equal. And what's important there is to depersonalize it, right? So I'm actually, when we're talking about these different structures, right, we can be talking about second, third, fourth order consciousness, we can be talking about concrete operations, formal operations, the pluralistic mind, we can be talking about different levels of values. We're not actually talking about people, right? All people have access to all these different structures. They're actually structures of thinking. They're more like frequencies that are permeating our environment, and we can tune into them, right? So the question is, how do you tune your body-mind to a frequency that is high enough and good enough to actually allow you to relate to your environment in a way that's going to be responsive and adaptive and appropriate, right? So it's a shifting away we're thinking about our psychology. It becomes more impersonal. It becomes more about how aware are you of your perspective? What are you tuning into right now? When you have thoughts arising in your mind, where are they coming from? Are they yours? Did you really will that thought to come? Or is it kind of just flowing through you and you're channeling it, right? And if you pay really close attention, and it seems like, oh wow, like I actually can't stop these thoughts, so it must not be me who's making them come. It's almost like you're becoming more aware of the fact that you're just picking up a signal, right? There's all these signals permeating our environment, and we think it's us. We identify with it. We're like, oh, well, that's me. That's what I think. That's what I believe. But actually, you can tune your dial so that you can pick up a different signal and resonate just as strongly with that, maybe even more strongly. And part of the experience of that is the sort of finer or higher the frequency is, the more true you realize it is. You realize, oh, I was mistaken. You know, I thought that like my group is right and that group is wrong, and that race was evil and that my race was good. And then I tuned into this other frequency. I had this realization, we're all brothers and sisters. And that's more true. That station is actually more true, right? And that's one way of describing the process of development. It's not about, oh, these people think this and these people think this. It's why are certain people resonating with certain frequencies? Why are certain people identifying with streams of consciousness that are not adapted for them, right? So when we shift the picture in that way, we can be more helpful and help people loosen up a little bit and actually get more metacognitive to do what they need to do to kind of tune into a better frequency that's going to be more helpful for everyone. So there's a lot more to talk about here. For instance, one distinction I'll make is that, you know, certain values and codes and symbols and ways of communicating emerge over time, right? So we can think of traditional society, modern society, postmodern society, and those words represent whole worlds of information, symbols, ways of thinking, ways of making sense, ways of valuing, right? And when those things emerge, we get exposed to them. And we might actually use the language that some of those ways of thinking or some of those structures embody, but that doesn't mean we actually have the complexity to really understand what we're saying. So for instance, what's happening nowadays, and I'll shift it, if we think about cultural values, if we think about symbolic worlds, right? If we think about value memes, you can call them. Memes being symbols, information, ideas that spread through people, in and through people, right? So these different frequencies or different structures, different symbolic worlds of meaning making have emerged over time, right? From what we could call tribal to traditional to modern to postmodern. We're living in a world now where our media, you can see in our media landscape, there's this battle going on, right? Between the traditional and modern conservatives, right? Versus the modern / postmodern progressives, right? There's people are tuning into these frequencies and they're battling it out. It's really entertaining, right? That's why everybody watches the media and the news. Because you have these more traditional values that are, you know, nation-centric, ethnocentric, in-group, out-group, really black and white, right versus wrong, socially conservative in many ways. And then some people who are bleeding more into a sort of modern view of individualism, capitalism, materialism, self-reliance, individuality, you know, this is the way I'm making sense of the world, pro-business, but somehow, so you have your social conservatives and your fiscal conservatives there, right? And they're kind of forming a tribe. Okay, so that's one tribe. And then you have sort of, you know, your blue dog Democrats, also modern, they get capitalism and growth and they buy into all that and individuality and meritocracy, but a little bit more socially progressive, maybe bleeding into the more postmodern values, pluralism, equality, you know, relativism, we're all really equal, trying to be more sensitive, right? These are the things that we're living in. This is the water that we're swimming in, right? We can see it, right? You see it. We're all swimming in it. But all those perspectives are not really able to step back and see the sea of perspectives, right? They're not able to actually be metacognitive about what they're doing. They're stuck, so many of us, are just stuck in the ignorance of thinking that that's us, right? We're identifying with it. We're like, oh yeah, well that's right and that's wrong. But it's just, we've got to get out of that. We have fundamentally that's the adaptation that our species has to make right now, is to actually make this jump. So one way of thinking about this jump that needs to happen, so all these can be thought of as first tier, and then whatever's after that can be thought of as second tier. That's from integral theory. It's just one way of thinking about it. The point is that there's a significant difference between being a postmodern liberal progressive who thinks that they're all about equality and world-centric values and green values, who's just hating on the conservatives all day and is just in that rivalry and just really doesn't get the inherent contradictions in their own perspective, in their own hatefulness, in their own lack of empathy and compassion, and in the fact that they're actually not really much more conscious of the fact that they're just channeling a station than the conservative is that they're channeling a station, right? So seeing that you actually are equal in that way can be illuminating for progressives and liberals. And that's sort of what part of my message is here today, is to push people who resonate with this sort of green frequency to kind of get beyond whatever norms have been established in your community, in your social world, in your media exposure, and to step out of the narrative warfare and to try to take on a bigger picture and a bigger identity. Because postmodern structures that have emerged, they're reactive to modernity, but they haven't really resolved the problems of modernity, right? We're still stuck with the fundamental big problems of modernity, which can be thought of as sustainability or ecological crisis, right? Alienation, and the fact that our hyper-individuated selves are lonely and stressed out and committing suicide and unhappy. And our lack of meaning, right? We're in this world of relativism, because one of the problems of the green postmodern structure that has emerged in reaction to modernity, in reaction to anti-colonialist, anti-racist, anti-all the bad stuff of modernity, which is why it's dialectical and it's a growth and it's better than. The problem is we fall into this place where then it's hard to make judgments about anything. Oh, we're all just equal. And that's where we get stuck with it's hard to really acknowledge growth-oriented hierarchy, development-based hierarchy, because that's even more complex. That's like the next step. Beyond seeing that we're all equal and that hierarchy is bad and modernist hierarchy is bad, we need to move into a both-and view where we see that that's true, but we still find, oh, there are actually broader and deeper perspectives that we can inhabit. So one way of thinking about this too, all the problems I mentioned at the beginning, when we think of social problems, cultural problems, economic problems, ecological problems, media problems that we see, political problems, they're all a result of this sort of stretching out, right? Back in the distant past, it was a much smaller spectrum of possibility. Most people just grew up in their family, their tribe, their culture. They weren't exposed to that much different. There was no complication or complexity, right? And there weren't a lot of different, radically different views fighting against each other all the time. And we didn't have exposure to them 24/7 through social media, right? So it's just like, our environment is crazy right now in terms of the cognitive demands and emotional demands that it places on us to be at peace and to make sense of what's happening. And this stretching out of perspectives is really at the root of a lot of our problems, because it's a lot for us to manage. And each individual to grow through these stages and to keep an open-hearted perspective where we actually have empathy for different perspectives, it's asking a lot, which is why it's not going to be easy for us to make the adaptation that we need to make. And yet, this is the truest story I can tell. So it seems to me that that is in fact what we need to do. So here we are, right? We're stuck in this place where patterns and habits of conflict and difference and rivalry are getting us stuck. And part of the problem, as I mentioned, we're overly personalizing our views, and we're also we're seeing other people as overly static, right? We're seeing people as nouns, like you are this, you think that, as opposed to verbs, right? We are all in process. We all should be in a process of becoming. We are all in movement, and the more that we can see ourselves and each other as being a part of this evolutionary process, the more we can relax our tendency to be rivalrous and to be thinking, I am this self and you are that self and we're different. It needs to be more open, right? So one way to do that is to always look for the truth in others' perspectives as opposed to just critique. And we are really stuck in our culture right now, perpetually critiquing other people's views, partly because other people's views are lacking, and it's really easy to do that, right? Like, we can see a lot of problems, and we have adequate critiques. I'm not saying the critiques are not accurate. I'm saying there's also some truth. Every single person in this world has some truth, some partial truth, and there is a reason why they think and believe what they think and they believe. And they are not that fundamentally different from you. If you had their karma and their environment, you would very likely be resonating and tuned in to the dial and the frequency that they are, right? So to see it that way as much as possible is really crucial, because a point I want to make, there's a contradiction here, right? On one hand, there's this dialectic of emergence, where some views are better than others, and they have emerged over time through history in groups, when we look at the patterns of social groups and the patterns of history and of making sense. And they also emerge in each individual throughout their lifespan, at least potentially, right? Children and adults can go through these different ways of sense making. But in relationship with each other, we're not really fostering that dialectical emergence, right? We're not really leaving space for the better view, the higher view, the more complex view to kind of win the day because we're too locked into our identities. So we have to shift and mature our ways of relating so we can foster and facilitate that dialectical emergence in relationship and in conversation. So we have to untether ourselves from our habitual ways of thinking and responding so that we can open a way for more conversations that move everyone forward, right? In conversation, ideally, there should be this openness where people are actually seeking for what the best perspective is. They're not just simply looking to articulate the perspective they already have, right? So that's a fundamental shift that we would have to make. And that's how we can move from fragmented pluralism to integrated pluralism, right? So we need a shared meta-narrative, I'm saying, which is this big picture story. We're all in this together. It's all one thing that's happening, and we're all in it. And we need different ways of communicating and relating to each other. So one way of thinking about this that I've been appreciating recently, so I've mentioned sort of traditional, modern, postmodern. I haven't gone into a lot of detail describing what those are. I'm feeling like there's enough resonance that people have some idea to think about what those are. But the question is, so what's emerging next? What's emerging now? What is sort of the leading edge of culture? So some people think of it as integral, some people think of it as meta-modern, you could just think of it as post-postmodern. But the realization is that there are people around the world right now who are tuning into this story, who are able to kind of see this way of looking at how things have emerged, and are trying to actually solve the problems of modernity and the residual problems of pre-modernity, right? So again, we think about inequality, sustainability, and alienation as the problems of modernity, and also all the problems that existed prior to that. And one fundamental shift we have to make too is to, again, get out of this conservative versus progressive binary, not accepting things as they are, as the status quo is the way it should be, which is kind of the conservative sort of implicit bias. And for progressives, not denying that things are the way they are for a reason, right? You can't just think, oh, well, things should be different, or this is terrible, or this is horrible. It's like, no, actually it makes sense. Actually, the way things are does make sense. And if you're not making full sense of it, seek more information, seek a broader view, seek to learn and understand more instead of just raging against the machine all the time, right? So another insight we can come to is that we can't just impose a new system on people. We're not just going to be able to come to, okay, this is the answer, and then this is what we have to do. That's because when we look back in history, that's not how things have emerged and changed over time. We have to actually cultivate processes that target culture and human development and developmental psychology and sociology. So we have to ask the question, what's going to help people grow and mature? Not how do we get to cut carbon emissions as soon as possible? Because most people aren't ready for that. They're not tuning into that. The question is, how do you get more people to want to save the earth? How do you get more people to tune in to a higher frequency? What do we have to do in terms of taking care of each other to foster and facilitate that kind of growth? It's an important but different shift. And another point here which relates in I think a beautiful way to Quakerism is that one of the realizations that you come to on this path, I think, is that you realize you can't trust the authority of any one person, including yourself, right? You are in a world of interconnected diversity. There are diverse perspectives. No one has all the answers. I'm not saying I have all the answers and everyone just needs to think like me. What we need to do is to make a shift toward process, where we cannot trust one view. What we need to trust is the processes through which we seek truth together in a distributed, decentralized way, right? Which is one way of thinking about democracy, right? We need to improve our democratic systems so that actually the decisions that get made and the sense-making that we come to as a collective is actually higher and better and more attuned to the environment than what any one individual could come up with alone, right? And when we think about Quaker process, I feel like that's actually a part of it. It's sort of this opening the way for the truth to emerge in a group of people. And we need our democratic processes to actually reflect something more like that, where how do we actually make it so that we're sense-making together? Because I would say that's another way of describing the sort of attractor point that we're moving to, something we're all being pulled toward, fighting and kicking and screaming, is ways of making sense together, right? We're all connected. We have to find a way to make sense of things together, not in rivalry and not as individuals. The individual perspective is no longer good enough. The individual that sort of emerged with modernity, this whole sense of I am an individual and meritocracy, and I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, and how I work and how I think, and me, my, determines everything, that is no longer adaptive. That is now maladaptive. Even thinking of yourself as an individual in that way is evolutionarily maladaptive. Right? We have to move beyond that sense of individuality and move more toward an inter-individuality, or interbeing, right? Or the dividual. So, these are, if I had to recommend 2 books to kind of unpack much more of what I'm saying today, I'd recommend these 2, which are actually written by co-authors who are writing under the pseudonym Hansi Freinacht, and sharing this idea of, when we understand modern ideas, faith in science, development, progress, the individual, we can understand postmodern ideas as a critique of that, emphasis on context, emphasis on justice and social justice and righting oppression, emphasis on multiculturalism, all these good things. We're still left with a lot of questions, right, of how do we integrate these different perspectives. And it's an open search for trying to actually resolve some of these issues. The idea of the listening society is kind of what I said. It's the idea of we actually need to create a society where we are listened to and heard and nurtured, so that it's not just a welfare state for physical well-being and food and clothing and shelter. It's actually a higher order welfare state where we're actually concerned with the welfare of our psychology and our emotions and our development, right? How do we have a developmentally nurturing and appropriate social structure? That is a society that we need to create, because it's not just about making people do certain things, it's about helping people grow up. And Nordic ideology kind of unpacks, with some specificity, different ways that we need to approach that through politics. 2 I'll mention is just really improving democracy. We should not be thinking that we live in a democracy and it just is the way it is. It's an ongoing experiment. We have a long way to go to really make democracy functional, so we need to keep updating our democratic operating system. And in order to do that, we need to be rooted in some social sense of truth, right? We need to have some socially acceptable means to get beyond the culture wars and the narrative warfare where everyone's just sort of in this post-truth environment where nobody really believes basic facts. And we need to somehow have a way of what Hansi calls empirical politics. So actually, we need to find a way to integrate our systems of sense-making and media with our government and democracy, so that we have trustworthy sources of information that we can all kind of tune into to help us all kind of raise our frequency together around shared facts and truths and data. So thinking into the future, again, just to kind of close, I think it's helpful also, again, big picture, to think about the way that we've grown so far, the way humanity's grown so far through time. Our relationship to our environment has been very much like a child to a parent. We're just taking, and we've reached the physical limits of what we can do. So we're kind of like at that adolescent stage where we're physically grown, we have physically taken over the planet, but it's time for a huge phase shift of maturation from adolescence to adulthood, right, as a species. There's a huge transition that we're coming up to right now. We literally cannot keep going the way that we're going. And a lot of the doomsday, negativity, lack of optimism about the future is coming from the fact that we're realizing we're going to have a reckoning ahead of us. The way that we're doing economics and production is just not going to sustain us. It's going to collapse, it's going to change, it's going to fundamentally shift. But I think it's really helpful when you see it in an evolutionary way to try to take on some different metaphors. Maybe it's more like a caterpillar is completely unsustainable when it's just chewing up all the leaves and destroying the plants, right? That can't continue either. Something has to shift. And all the plants would be destroyed, and the caterpillar would gorge itself to death if it didn't transform into a butterfly, right? So we're at a transformative stage as a species. We don't know what the future exactly looks like, but we can feel that a big shift is coming, and I do think it is. So again, I think that comes through opening to a space beyond identity, where we stop reenacting and propagating our mimetic responses to things and stop living and acting from those really deep grooves that come from our ancestral past, and try to be metacognitive about how we're thinking so that we can open up space in relationship for real dialogue, real inquiry, real shared sense-making, and answering some of the meta-modern questions that we are faced with as a species. And with that, I would just like to close again, just sort of thinking about the big picture. Allow yourself to have if you can, a sense of cosmic gratitude, right? Like everything, just everything that's happened in the last at least 13 billion years has led us to this point. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake. All of it was necessary. And it's quite possible that, you know, our ability to positively influence and nurture and support and align with the evolutionary process is dependent on our ability to enact a conscious, responsing, loving, attuned relationship to everything that is emergent right now. So we have to ask ourselves, are we answering that call? Are we actually really living up to that charge, if that's the charge of our species right now? Because potentials become realized when we recognize them and then can act on them. So part of talks like this is so that we can better identify and recognize what potentials there are, and now we can go about the work of trying to realize them. And for myself, happy to be in touch with people. You can find me online, and I'll just end on a personal note saying that in the last couple of years I've been giving talks like this, and I'm recording them and putting them out there, but I'm actually moving away from doing that and moving more toward doing meditation retreats and meditation classes, because what I'm feeling into is really the need to come together in small groups, face to face, get people off their computer screens and off of watching videos all day, and actually how do we actually practice and think together so that in small groups of people all around the world we can kind of raise that frequency. So I'm definitely, it's an open invitation for all of you to join me. There's a retreat coming up in November and starting a weekly meditation class here in Chapel Hill on Tuesday evenings. Starting December 15th, I'll be teaching meditation at 1,000 Petals Yoga on Tuesdays at 7:30. And I'm hoping that a community can form there that's really going pretty deep into thinking about some of these things, but also doing meditation practices that actually help us kind of tune our body-mind to those higher states and higher structures. So thank you. I meant to leave more time for questions. I'm sorry that I did not leave a lot of time for questions, but I would love to take some now, and I'd be happy to stay after or talk any other time with anybody that wants to.
I love the way you think, and I enjoy listening to you think. But it doesn't seem to recognize or deal with the issues of power and militarism as it's controlled by those in power, or capitalism that has shaped our world and is shaping our world in ways that are non-democratic and maybe impenetrable by some of this way of seeing and thinking about the world.
Thank you for that. I personally do try to account for that and think about that a lot, and so do some of the authors that I'm really referencing. So for instance, the perspective that's being generated through texts like these is definitely trying to account for that. It's not ignoring the really deep, intractable problems that are rooted in capitalism and our political system. But it really is, so it's sort of taking that as a given. So it's actually, the conversation I'm trying to have here is with folks who I know already know that, right? And are already tuned into that and really upset about that and are overwhelmed by that. And then for us, I think the question is, okay, how do we integrate that into a bigger picture that will actually help us solve those problems? Because those are very real problems. But it's also, again, I think there's a way in which it still makes sense, the way that things are, the problems that we've gotten ourselves into, and the way that we're destroying the whole planet and each other. For me, the impulse and the intention is to try to make sense of it so that it's not a blame game, but it really is a constructive, where do we go from here game. And I would say these texts, I mean, do get into that, and also, these texts are really where I'm coming from in terms of understanding and lots of other books, but these are some good ones. And for instance, if you really want to understand like debt in our economic system, I would recommend this book by David Graeber, also Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a new book that's really looking at updating our critiques and understanding of just how pervasive and pernicious our tech-based capitalist system is. So it's bad. Oh, it's really, really, really bad. But, yeah.
Just one more 2 seconds. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about on workers on Labor Day, and I just think that for Quakers and others who are thinking in certain ways, there just isn't much experience with working class people who confront the controls of capitalist society in a very intimate and profound way every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of skimming along the top of that issue, which is so profound in so very many people's lives.
Yeah, totally. But and there's not, again, we're talking about a world of 7 billion people. There's a lot of work to do and different kinds of work to do. So wherever you are, meet that problem with as big of a heart as you can. And having empathy, part of the meta-modern move is having empathy with as many perspectives as possible, right? So what I'm feeling from you is a deep empathy for the working class, deep empathy for the people who are being oppressed and marginalized by capitalism. That is definitely included in this vision, but it's not, it is not the only thing included in this vision.
Thank you very much for this, Brad. Very helpful. I do think Tom's point is well taken, and it's illustrated not just in the lack of communication between workers and the rest of us, but we see it internationally. It seems to me that a friend of mine is just back from a prolonged stay in India, and he was celebrated. What he saw there is still some relatively free expression of ideas about the crisis in Kashmir. And if we contrast that with what's happening in China with the Hong Kong situation, where free expression in mainland China is cut off in large degree, your point of communicating the dialectic necessary for understanding sees this in these examples. Brexit, perhaps, would it ever have happened if there had been that dialogue that we lack between workers and others? So your call for communications and the freedom of understanding other people's viewpoints, I think is very, very well placed.
Yeah, but still, there's so many different levels of analysis, right? And there's our sort of microscopic worlds of interpersonal relationships. Right. There's this sort of meso world of the jobs that we have in our local community and our political system, and then there's the macro world of like macroeconomics, global trade, the relations that are happening between nation states and the UN. So there's just so many. So it's not. I appreciate. I want a chance to say, what I'm more focusing on is on the micro, like for individuals and their body minds and their hearts and how we're tuning as individuals in our day-to-day lives. Not saying that it would be part of the naivete of sort of the 60s and the initial postmodern movement to think that just like nonviolent communication is going to solve problems between like China and Hong Kong and like Trump, right? Like those folks are not, because they're not tuned into that frequency, right? So it's not naive in the sense that like, oh, just like sing Kumbaya and like listen to each other and it's all going to get better. It's actually the opposite of that. It's seeing the immensity of the scope and how no matter how much we're fighting, there's these underlying dynamics that needs to shift for it to be effective, which does not take away the need for protest, political participation. A lot of the tools of postmodern activists are still valid in certain contexts, but as a way of understanding why, there's still always ongoing improvement and refinement that can happen. And just at the individual level of what I see it's doing to people's stress and their hearts and their peace and their happiness. It's like, how do you actually engage as a bodhisattva in the world who's working for social justice, and maybe you're out there marching, but you're doing it in a very different way than a really radicalized teenager who's like angry and, maybe going to commit suicide in a few years because the world is so crazy and stressed, right? It's like there are these qualitative jumps we can make in how we hold it, which doesn't necessarily explain what actually needs to happen. And that's the thing. I'm not claiming to know what actually needs to happen. Like to actually improve China, or to help Chinese government realize that they should be more open to decentralization and democracy and free speech. Like those are the polls, and it actually will happen. But it's not going to be pretty because they're fighting it, right? But it's also seeing that there's hope and optimism in the fact it will happen. It's a strange attractor, and it's pulling them. And that's why people in Hong Kong are going to keep fighting. It's going to happen. It's just going to be violent and bloody and messy and nasty. And that's, I don't think it actually can be avoided, unfortunately, is part of the point.
I like the tension that you've just drawn between more individual work and group collective work, and how they may be different and they may benefit from each other. I also see possibly some interesting tension between individual growth and as the individual matures and reaches perhaps these states of consciousness that you're talking about that are attractive, we can't just jump there. We have to kind of own who we are, our very individual aspects of our upbringing, the town, the city, the parents, all our own limits and blessings and our own individual growth before we can transcend that in a way. And I think that's an interesting tension. So,
Yeah, totally.
just quickly, I was at the memorial service for a cousin Friday in eastern North Carolina, where politically and culturally I'm quite different from many of my eastern North Carolina family. And in an interaction with another cousin, he said something that put me off, you know, and I in that moment, at that time, because we were both mourning the loss of a loved cousin, I think I could step back and avoid, and he did too. I mean, we kind of reached this impasse, and it was like, it was a chance comment. I'm not talking about a long discussion. But I think we have to be, that's where I came from, that's who my people are, that's who, you know, it's a very individual thing. Before we reach a point, we can't jump over and get to this point.
It's so true. No, and there's a real humbling aspect to that. And that's partly why, for me, the way I try to present things today was a little bit different than the way I've been doing it for years, whereas the emphasis can just be on human development and growth. And the shift for me is emphasizing more stories and relationship, right? Because for me, the two things I wanted to emphasize was we need better shared big picture stories that actually help explain the world and make sense of the world, and we need to really fine tune how we're relating to each other, because those can actually be engines of growth and development. But you can't actually rush the growth and development pieces. Actually, all the research says that most adults between the ages of, say, 35 and 75 don't generally experience really structural growth. Once you kind of plateau as a young adult, and you kind of find your center of gravity and the frequency that you're going to identify with, most people just stay there the rest of their lives. And it's actually hard to enact real fundamental perspectival value structure identity growth through adulthood. So there's it's a slow process, and we see it in some ways it's accelerating, but in some ways you have to just accept the fact that you can't, that's the bind we're in. We need to update our operating systems, and we need to actually push this thing along and nurture that growth as quickly as possible, and it has its own sort of natural flowering to it. But I would say that one thing that the research does show is that actually meditation and spiritual practices are the few things that consistently not only achieve different states, so there's a much more complex picture of individual development that we could draw. Mostly I've been talking in really general terms about these structures, but any individual, point I wanted to make earlier too, which kind of connects, every individual is so complex and so dynamic, you can never reduce an individual to one of these perspectives. It's like we have states, we have state stages, we have peak experiences, we regress, we go up and down, we have different personality types, we have different archetypes that we're channeling. There's just so much to each individual. And another thing that's happening in evolution is actually not only the evolution of complexity and consciousness, also the evolution of increasing uniqueness is another way to look at it. Like, we are all more unique than blades of grass are from each other, right? You could argue we're all more unique than other mammals are from each other, right? So the more evolved you get, the more unique you are. And we're all actually really beautiful, unique expressions of universe evolving and manifesting, right? So that view also helps me to really see each person, like, these structures are impersonal. We're kind of all swimming in them. Don't identify anyone with those structures, and see that each individual is just a completely unique expression of like life force. And there's a way in which no matter what that person says, if you're holding them in that way, you'll feel it differently and you'll hear it differently. So that's part of one way of describing what I think needs to happen.